The death of George Floyd in the U.S. in police custody and the wave of protests that followed have sparked discussions about systemic racism in this country. In fact, though, a report from 3 years ago laid out Canada's situation in pretty stark terms. The UN Working Group of Experts on People of African Descent concluded in part that it is deeply concerned by the structural racism that lies at the core of many Canadian institutions and the systemic anti-Black racism that continues to have a negative impact on the human rights situation of African Canadians. That was in 2017. The report came with dozens of recommendations, like a nationwide mandatory policy on the collection of racial data, and that the government address anti-Black racism in the criminal justice system. So how else does that report speak to current issues? Dominique Day is the vice chair of the UN Working Group of Experts on People of African Descent. She joins us now from New York City. Hi, Ms. Day. It's great to have you with us on the program.
Hi there. Thank you so much for having me.
I appreciate it very much. I have to say that it's been very fascinating to read through that report in light of current events, in light of the discussion that's taking place in this country. What do you think the most important conclusion reached in the report is, given what's happening right now?
I guess I would say a couple things. The keeping of disaggregated data so we can pinpoint the areas of racial discrimination and violence where we're seeing both racial disparities and real opportunities to improve, and the absolute urgency of focusing on racial profiling and the targeting of people of African descent in the criminal justice system, which is sidelining the generations of excellence out of legacy systems of racial control. But I will say it's a very robust report.
It is.
So there's a wide variety.
That's why I asked you to highlight a few, because I feel like it is incredibly robust. I think everyone should read it because it's also very informative. But I think there are some big takeaways, especially in light of, for example, the conversation right now, even around COVID-19 and whether that disaggregated data is being collected. It's not, for the most part, in this country. I'm wondering what your assessment is on the way in which this country and the federal government in this country have responded in the 3 years since that report.
Well, obviously we haven't done a follow-up report yet. I think we hope to do that in a few years. But what we've seen is some really wonderful language. There's been talk about systemic racism at the federal level. We've seen some provinces really talking about how to grapple with this. We haven't necessarily seen the resources or the political will to actually implement this. So when we're talking about how do you implement a recommendation, it's not really about who you hire or even how much money you allocate. It's about the outcomes and how do you measure change? How do you measure commitment through the outcomes to the impacted communities? And that seems to be absent at this time from the ways they're thinking about, the ways that Canada is thinking about looking at the 2019 anti-racism strategy, looking at the implementation of the International Decade for People of African Descent. We have to look at the outcomes to the impacted community far more than who gets hired in which position.
If I'm interpreting what you're saying correctly, and please do correct me if I'm wrong, accountability is important. Like, there has to be a mechanism to figure out if what you're doing is actually having the desired impact.
Absolutely. The community itself, the experience of the impacted communities has to drive our understanding of what's adequate. It's not enough to give training to somebody. You actually need to make sure that people on the street are experiencing improvement and equality and justice.
There are still some politicians at the provincial level, one in particular in Quebec, who deny that systemic racism exists. And I'm wondering to what degree that is an impediment to doing what you just laid out.
It's the biggest impediment in the world. If nothing else, institutions that have been identified and proven through research as perpetrators of institutional racism have the absolute obligation to educate themselves, to understand this, and to really dive into collecting data and understanding which racial disparities are driving ongoing discrimination. So I've seen the statements that, I don't understand why people use this word discrimination. It's a few bad apples. It's not a few bad apples. That's what we're seeing around the world right now. But more importantly, understanding how systemic racism operates, including in policing, including in facilitating impunity, right? The impunity to end Black lives, understanding that is actually part of your job as a politician, as a police commander, as a person who is a servant to the public, as a representative of the government.
I think, and I've listened very closely to those who are saying, or who are unwilling to admit, A, that yes, it is a fact that it exists, or B, they're just rejecting the notion altogether. And the way in which they seem to interpret it is, you're trying to say everyone's racist, and I reject that notion, therefore I reject systemic racism. That's not accurate, right?
No, absolutely not. When we're talking about systemic racism, we're talking about a set of intersecting policies and practices that are operating almost on their own to create and perpetuate racial discrimination. And in fact, there's social conditioning that allows most of society to turn a blind eye. And we get that in our education, we get that in the media. When we're thinking about what it looks like to target institutional racism, we have to recognize that we're all living inside a legacy of racial control that goes all the way back to the trade and trafficking in enslaved Africans. So it's not that everyone in the world is walking around with active racial animus. It's that our systems themselves grew out of a legacy, right? A legacy of racial control and a legacy of the exploitation of Black bodies. And to dismantle that, we have to dismantle the mindsets that grew from that and that continue to operate in our society.
I think also specifically at the outset, after watching that horrifying video here in Canada, there were a number of people who almost instinctually, said, oh goodness, we're not that bad, right? That kind of thing couldn't happen here. What we've seen since, and we should have all seen prior, is that it very much does happen. But we're also, like those, comforted, I think, to a degree by those words that you referenced, right? Lots of governments are saying things very differently than the government in the United States, for example. And so I'm wondering, based on this report, what you would say to those Canadians, or even people in the government who are kind of deflecting to the idea that we are not them. Being the U.S.
Right. And of course, every country is different. But I think if you look at the protests that are happening around the world right now, people are protesting, sure, in part in solidarity with what's happening here in the U.S., but also because they personally relate to what's happened. They personally have experienced this kind of policing. And I think the thing to remember is that we already have all the tools, right? So it may be that all Canadians don't see or don't experience the kind of racism that Black Canadians have experienced. But luckily, there's the expertise of the stories. There's the expertise of the data that is collected. There's the expertise of Black academics, Black policy people, Black people in government who are working every day to try to dismantle these systems of racism that threaten Black lives. And so on some level, maybe it makes sense that if you are not a person with brown skin, you might not be aware of the racism that's taking place by your government in your name. But luckily, Canada is a beautiful country, and you have the expertise right there to get that information to answer those questions. We've tried to offer a good amount of analysis specific to Canada in our reports. Committee to End All Forms of Racial Discrimination has done the same. But also there's tremendous resources inside Canada itself with respect to how this looks locally, and that although Canada is very different from the United States, the fact that our policing models actually grew out of slave patrols, grew from enslavement, means that the policing models country to country are often quite similar and operate similarly against the same groups of people. You have the opportunity as Canadians to dive into the Canadian expertise that can inform a profound commitment to human rights and to social protection.
Right. I have to leave it there. I'm out of time, unfortunately. Thank you, Ms. Day. I apprate your time.
Thank you.
Dominique
Thank you so
Day
much.
is the Vice Chair of the UN Working Group of Experts on People of African Descent. Hi, I'm Vashi Capellos, host of Power in Politics. See more of our show by subscribing to the CBC News channel or click the link for another video.